I was still in uniform when my father told me that my leg wasn't worth $10,000. I stood in a sterile Boston hospital corridor, my surgical scrubs still stained with blood. I was a second-year surgical resident. In Boston, that means working 80-hour weeks for a stipend that barely covers student loans and overpriced rent. My medical degree was a promise of a future, but my bank account was a desert. The doctor had just used the word disability not as a threat, but as a clinical fact, if surgery didn't happen immediately. I pressed the phone to my ear, my knee swollen so badly the fabric strained. On the other end, my father sighed. He told me they just bought a vintage Porsche 356 Speedster. My mother let out a long, tired sigh, while my sister laughed, calling this my lesson in negligence. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I simply fell into a deathly calculated silence. Have you ever been told your health was less important than a status symbol? Let me know your story down in the comments. I'd love to know who is part of our community. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't argue with my father about the market value of a vintage Porsche versus my ability to perform surgery. I simply pressed the red icon on my screen and ended the call. The sterile hum of the hospital hallway rushed back in to fill the space where his voice had been. I sat on a hard metal bench, my surgical scrubs still damp with sweat and a stranger's blood, and I took a deep breath. Anger wasn't loud this time, it was clinical. I rubbed my eyes, not to wipe away tears, but to sharpen my focus. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a balance sheet, and I was currently deep in the red. I opened my laptop, right there in the corridor, my hands steady, despite the throbbing in my knee that felt like a white-hot pulse. I wasn't looking for sympathy, I was looking for capital. I started clicking through every predatory lender and salary advance service I had ever heard of. I didn't care about the 24% interest rates or the ruthless repayment schedules. I only cared about the $10,000 required to keep my slot in the operating room. I traded my future financial stability for the immediate preservation of my hands and my career. Every digital signature was a contract. I was signing with myself a promise to never be in this position again. I realized then that I had been the silent investor in their version of family for 27 years. And today, my dividend was a no that sounded like a final notice. A shadow fell across my screen, and I looked up. My brother, Jackson, was standing there. He smelled of industrial oil and old exhaust. His face was streaked with soot from a double shift at the mechanic shop, and his eyes carried a heavy, quiet exhaustion. He didn't ask me what our father had said. He didn't have to. He reached into the pocket of his grease-stained canvas jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. He pressed it into my hand. It was $2,000 in crumpled 10s and 20s, the exact amount he had received for selling his professional-grade welding kit. Those tools were his only means of making a living, his entire livelihood. I stared at the money, then at him. "You sold them," I whispered. He just gave me a small, tired nod. "I need you walking, Madison," he said. "I'll figure the metal out later." In that moment, the invisible chains I had worn my entire life snapped. I had spent 27 years as the survivor in a toxic household, trapped in a specific kind of internal prison, where you learn to be quiet and reliable, just to maintain a fragile peace. I had convinced myself that my silence was proof of my strength, but looking at Jackson's scarred hands, I realized my silence had just been a cage. I was done being the silent victim of my parents' normalized cruelty. I was done waiting for a seat at a table that was intentionally built to exclude me. Jackson wasn't just giving me $2,000. He was giving me the first real piece of evidence that family isn't a biological byproduct. It is a choice. He chose me when I was bleeding, while our parents chose a status symbol. I took the money, not because it was enough, but because I needed to remember the weight of his sacrifice. I needed to remember exactly who showed up when the floor was covered in blood. This wasn't a family drama anymore. It was accounting, and I was about to audit every single one of them. As I lay in that narrow hospital bed, waiting for the surgical team to wheel me under the fluorescent lights, the phantom pain in my knee wasn't the only thing throbbing. My mind drifted back to the dinner table of my childhood, a place where the seating chart was determined by potential return on investment, and I was always sitting at the spares table. I watched the ceiling tiles pass by, each one a frame in a long, silent movie of every time I was told my needs were secondary to someone else's performance. I remembered when I was 24 and Ashley decided to launch her holistic wellness empire. She burned through $30,000 of my parents' savings in just 4 months. There were no contracts, no interest rates, and certainly no lectures about the gravity of the situation. My mother had called it finding her light, and my father simply patted her head and wrote another check, framing her bankruptcy as a necessary cost of doing business. They saw Ashley as an asset worth protecting, a brand they were desperate to build, even if the foundation was made of sand. Then there was me. At 22, my car's transmission had died in the middle of a Boston winter. I needed $2,000 to get to my clinical rotations at the hospital. It was the difference between finishing my degree and failing out. I didn't ask for a gift, I asked for a loan. I still remember the cold professional look in my father's eyes as he pulled a 3-page document from his printer. It was a notarized loan agreement, 5% interest, compounded monthly. My mother stood over me, her hand on my shoulder, not in comfort, but as a silent enforcer. "It builds character, Madison," she'd whispered, her voice smooth as glass. "You'll thank us later." For 6 months, I lived on canned beans and walked 4 miles to the grocery store in the snow just to make those payments on time. I paid them back 3 months early, hoping for a well done or a seat back at the family table. Instead, my father handed me an invoice for the notary fee he'd paid to have the contract signed. I realize now that I was caught in the trap of normalized cruelty. In our house, my parents had successfully rebranded their neglect as a lesson, and my sister's incompetence as potential. They had created a narrative where my suffering was a necessary part of my identity as the tough one, a role they assigned me, so they could feel better about giving everything to the child who offered them the best optics. I wasn't their daughter, I was the silent investor in their version of a perfect family. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, and my resilience was the collateral they used to fund my sister's delusions. But as the anesthesiologist approached with the mask, I felt a strange, icy clarity. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a balance sheet. I wasn't just here to fix my leg, I was here to close an account that had been open far too long. Richard and Kimberly had spent 27 years teaching me how to be precise, how to be cold, and how to value a contract over a person. It was time I showed them exactly how well I had learned their lessons. I woke up to the clinical smell of antiseptic and the heavy, stabilizing weight of a metal brace on my leg. The surgery had been successful, but recovery didn't come with an invitation back into the family fold. While I was learning to walk again, one agonizing step at a time, my phone remained a graveyard of missed opportunities for them to show they cared. There were no get well cards, no check-ins from my mother about my pain levels, not even a text from my father, asking if the surgery he refused to fund had actually worked. The bandages were eventually replaced by a sleek, professional brace, and with it came the arrival of my workers' compensation settlement. Because I had been injured while saving a patient during a high-stress emergency, the payout was substantial, $450,000. To the hospital's insurance firm, it was a rounding error to avoid a malpractice suit. To me, it was the war chest I needed to dismantle my father's empire. For the first time in my life, I had a surplus of capital. I sat in my quiet apartment, the check resting on the table, and realized that my parents' silence wasn't just a lack of communication. It was a market signal. I was no longer a liability they had to manage. I was a non-entity in their luxury-branded world. The silence finally broke on a Tuesday evening, but it wasn't the call I deserved. It was my mother, her voice high-pitched and frantic, with a different kind of stress. She didn't ask how my knee was, or if I could walk without crutches. She launched into a lecture about my selfishness for missing the upcoming reveal party for the Porsche 356 Speedster. "Your father has worked so hard for this, Madison," she snapped. The local car club will be there. We told everyone you'd be here to help serve. Your absence makes us look fragmented. It's negligent. I looked down at the scars on my knee, still red and angry. And then at the seven-figure debt, I knew they were hiding behind that vintage leather interior. My sister Ashley cut in on the other line, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Come on, Maddie. Just wear a long dress. No one will even notice the brace. Stop being so dramatic and do something for the family for once. The audacity was breathtaking. They wanted me to be the background scenery for their latest lie, a tough daughter prop to make their successful life look complete. I won't be there, I said. My voice was calm, factual, and lethal. I didn't explain. I didn't offer a medical excuse. I didn't give them the satisfaction of my anger. I hung up the phone and watched the screen go black. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was an investment strategy. I realized then that my compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for 27 years, and I was finally closing the account. I didn't go back to my spreadsheet. I didn't look at my rehab schedule. I picked up the phone and dialed a different number, a high-end financial lawyer in downtown Boston, whose time was as expensive as his reputation. When he answered, I didn't sound like a wounded daughter. I sounded like a majority shareholder. I want to initiate an audit, I told him. I want to know every cent my parents owe, every lien on their property, and exactly how much it will cost to buy their entire world out from under them. This wasn't revenge. This was accounting. The attorney's office in downtown Boston was all glass, steel, and quiet confidence. He didn't offer me tea or platitudes about family. Instead, he slid a thick manila folder across the mahogany desk. This, he said, is the story your parents tell themselves. I opened it and watched the myth of their success unravel in seconds. The house I'd grown up in, the one my mother called her nest egg, was leveraged to the edge, refinanced more times than I could count, and 3 months behind on payments. The vintage Porsche my father had used to justify my potential disability was financed through a loan that assumed future income that simply did not exist. My sister's business was bleeding cash, and every payroll was being covered by pulling equity out of a house that was already underwater. They weren't wealthy. They were just very good at pretending. My father hadn't refused to pay for my surgery because he loved a car more than me. He'd refused because he was a financial arsonist, trying to keep the flames away from the curtains. I stared at the numbers until they blurred. They had refused me $10,000 to save my career while setting fire to hundreds of thousands to preserve a performance for a car club that wouldn't even remember their names in a year. Can we protect you from this? My lawyer asked. Shield your assets so you're not exposed when it collapses. I closed the folder. No, I said. I don't want to run from their debt. I want to own it. That was the moment the plan became real. We moved quickly, efficiently, and with the silence of a surgeon. I formed a shell company, no personal identifiers, no family connections, just a clean clinical entity. Through my attorney, we approached the institutions holding my parents' bad debt. Banks don't love delinquent loans. They love clean books. They'll trade a toxic asset for liquid capital faster than most people realize. With nearly $500,000 in liquidity, I targeted their defaulted mortgage and the delinquent Porsche loan. I didn't buy the property, I bought the right to foreclose on it. I became my parents' primary creditor, and they didn't even know my name was on the debt. I didn't do it out of greed. I did it for clarity. Within 48 hours, I went from the daughter they dismissed to the shadow landlord who owned their house, their luxury car, and their entire fragile sense of stability. They had no idea. That was the coldest part of the calculation. I sat in my apartment, watching my leg heal, and realized that if I walked into their living room and told them the truth, they'd never sign what they were about to sign. So I didn't go as Madison. I went as opportunity. An intermediary reached out on behalf of my company, offering a sale and leaseback arrangement, immediate relief, no public foreclosure, and a small line of credit to stabilize my sister's failing ventures. They signed every page of the 50-page contract without reading the fine print. They assumed the rules didn't apply to people who looked as successful as they did. When the pen scratched against the paper, I felt a finality settle in my chest. I wasn't just walking again, I was standing on their foundation. The air in the attorney's office was thick with the scent of expensive toner and impending disaster. I sat perfectly still as he opened a second, thinner folder. I thought I had seen the worst of it, the debt, the lies, the frantic performance of a lifestyle they couldn't afford. But as the lawyer slid a copy of a trust fund document across the table, I realized I had only been looking at the surface of their betrayal. Richard Henderson hadn't just spent money he didn't have. He had systematically dismantled the future of the one person who had actually shown me love. Grandfather had left $40,000 in a restricted trust for Jackson. It was intended to be the capital for Jackson to open his own mechanic shop, a reward for years of loyalty and hard work. But the account was empty. I looked at the withdrawal slip, my eyes fixing on the signature at the bottom. It was Jackson's name, written in a hand that was too practiced, too fluid. It wasn't Jackson's shaky, grease-stained scrawl. It was my father's elegant, clinical script. Richard had forged his own son's signature to fund his delusions. He had stolen $40,000 from a 25-year-old man who worked 60 hours a week just to keep my father's house from foreclosure. I thought of Jackson's scarred hands and the way he had sold his only tools to save my leg, while our father was driving Jackson's stolen dreams in the form of a vintage Porsche. This wasn't just a family disagreement anymore. This was a felony. In that moment, I felt the weight of the silent regret of the watcher. I had spent years observing Jackson's slow erosion, watching him shrink under the burden of being the reliable one, just like me. I had felt a quiet, gnawing guilt that I couldn't do more to help him, but now I realized I had been a witness to a crime I didn't even know was happening. My father had treated Jackson like a resource to be mined, and my mother had stood by and watched the lights go out in her son's eyes. I stared at the forgery, and anger wasn't loud. It was an investment strategy. My father's signature on that document was more than a confession. It was the final dividend on a lifetime of neglect. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, and I was finally calling in the debt. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a balance sheet. And Richard Henderson was about to discover exactly what happens when you overdraft on a daughter's mercy. I didn't ask for a legal opinion. I didn't ask about the chances of a settlement. I looked at my lawyer and gave him the only instruction that mattered. I want the criminal evidence ready, I said. I'm not just his landlord anymore. I'm the one who holds the warrant. This was the kill shot. I was no longer the daughter sitting at the spares table. I was the majority shareholder in their destruction, and the audit was only beginning. They arrived 20 minutes late, complaining about the downtown traffic, as if their time was the only currency that mattered. Richard adjusted his tie, looking around the mahogany-paneled office with a smug sense of belonging, while Ashley checked her reflection in the glass, oblivious to the fact that the floor beneath her was no longer hers. My mother, Kimberly, let out a practiced, tired sigh, asking the receptionist when the senior partner would finally see them to discuss the temporary liquidity issue. I was already seated, my back to them in a high-backed leather chair. I listened as they spoke about me like I was an absent ghost, a tough daughter who would eventually figure out her own mess while they saved the family's optics. When the attorney finally nodded toward me, I rotated my chair to face them. The silence that followed was heavy, clinical, and absolute. Ashley's artificial smile didn't just fade, it evaporated. Kimberly's face drained of color, her hand flying to her throat as if she were trying to catch a breath that had been disconnected. My father just stared, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to find a version of reality where his discarded daughter was sitting in the seat of power. "Hello, Richard." "Kimberly," I said evenly. I didn't call them mom or dad. I had de-romanticized our relationship weeks ago. Now it was just a business transaction. I realized then that their love had been a subscription service, and I had finally stopped footing the bill. "Maddie, what is this?" My father managed to choke out. I didn't answer him directly. Instead, I placed two documents on the table. The first was the notarized loan agreement from when I was 22, the one where they charged me 5% interest to fix a car so I could work. The second was the evidence of the forgery, the withdrawal slips, where Richard had stolen $40,000 from Jackson's trust. You think your status is a birthright, but it's just an illusion, I said, my voice calm, factual, and lethal. This was the illusion of the empty wallet. Their entire lifestyle was a performance, a luxury brand built on the foundation of stolen dreams and debt. They weren't powerful, they were just tenants in a house of cards I now owned. Richard surged forward, his face turning a dark, panicked red, beginning to ramble about family and misunderstandings. I didn't interrupt. I listened the way I'd been trained to do during debriefs, watching him reveal his own desperation. I stood up, my leg holding my weight with a precision they had refused to fund. I leaned across the table, looking my father directly in the eye. You don't owe me $10,000 for a surgery, Richard, I said. You owe Jackson a future, and I am here to collect every cent. I handed my attorney the signed eviction notice. I was no longer the silent investor in their lies. I was the majority shareholder in their reality, and the audit was over. The fallout wasn't a loud explosion, it was the quiet, rhythmic sound of a liquidation. The house I grew up in, the one built on the equity of my silence, and Jackson's stolen future was listed and sold within 30 days to recover the assets I now controlled. I didn't keep the profit for myself. I didn't need to fund my life with their wreckage. Instead, I leveraged the remaining capital to secure a prime commercial lease and a full inventory of high-end equipment. I walked into a state-of-the-art mechanic shop on the outskirts of Boston, a place filled with the smell of new tires and real possibilities. I handed the deed to Jackson. For the first time in 25 years, he didn't look tired. He looked like a man who finally owned the ground he stood on. My father, Kimberly, and Ashley moved into a 2-bedroom rental where the carpet was stained and the optics were non-existent. Richard spent his days answering letters from the district attorney regarding the $40,000 he had embezzled from his own son. There were no more vintage cars, no more country club dinners, and no more performance of success. They had spent decades treating me like an insurance policy they could never pay out on. And now, they were discovering that a family built on transactions eventually goes bankrupt. I returned to the operating room 6 months after the surgery they refused to fund. As I scrubbed in, the water was cold, and the silence was absolute. I looked at my hands, the hands my father decided weren't worth $10,000, and they were surer than they had ever been. I realized then that letting go of a bloodline is not a betrayal. It is a surgical necessity. It is the amputation of a toxic limb to save the rest of the body. I have learned that family isn't the name on your birth certificate. It's the person who sells their livelihood so you can walk again. It's the loyalty that shows up when there is blood on the floor, not the one that asks if the timing is convenient. I opened my phone one last time, highlighted their names, and hit delete. I didn't feel anger, and I didn't feel triumph. I just felt the solid, painless weight of my own 2 feet on the ground. If you believe family is defined by loyalty, not just a last name, share this story. You're never alone.